Hi class, my name is Brady Stricker. I'm a sophomore here at State Fair Community College and I play on the baseball team. I was born and raised in Lee Summit, Missouri and grew up and played at Blue Spring South High School and is where I graduated. The book I chose to read for this assignment was Gorillas in the Mist by Dian Fossey, an unbelievable life story written by herself about her lifetime studies of mountain gorillas and risking her life for them. The reason I decided to choose this book was because ever since I was a little kid, one of my favorite things to do was go to the zoo. My favorite animal to look at every time was the gorillas and monkeys. And every time I went, I would try to save them for last because I knew that's where I'd spend the majority of my time. Another reason I chose this book is because I've also heard so many things about Dian Fossey in the past in her book, but I've never had the opportunity to actually read it. The book is about an amazing woman from Kentucky. She was inspired by an anthropologist named Louis Leakey who contribute her life to the study of gorillas and apes. The author first lands in Africa in 1963. So she was so determined to venture into Africa that she took out a massive loan to finance her initial 7-week trip where she would work with Dr. Louis Leakey. She made a terrible first impression on Leakey after she fell into a fossil digging hole, ended up shattering her ankle during the fall, which made her very nauseous. This nauseous led up to her throwing up on a pair of Leakey's fossils that he was working on. After the 7-week trip, she went back home to the U.S., hoping one day she would return to Africa. Other than her first impression, Dr. Leakey was still very impressed with her and her work. He encouraged her to return to Africa and continue her anthropological surveys. Leakey ends up paying the way for Fossey, and she returned to continue her studies of the gorillas. She went traveling into some of the deepest parts of Africa and ended up becoming so fascinated with the lives and different habits of the rare mountain gorillas of the Rwandan jungle. Fossey started developing ways of communication with the gorillas and became so obsessed with the apes. One of the younger gorillas swings from one branch in an attempt to impress her. She ends up naming that one Icarus. The 2 older males and 1 older female she names after famous composers, Bartok, Brahms, and Beethoven. Being accepted by each gorilla was Fossey writes a tremendous accomplishment. On average, it took a year and a half for the gorillas to approach Fossey. She put the gorillas into groups with their families. The groups were 4, 5, and 8. Fossey starts working with Group 8. She develops a friendly bond with Peanut, a plucky young chimp. Fossey would pretend to eat the same greens as the chimps. Her and Peanut would even play Simon Says. She discusses how each member of Group 8 has unique sound for each of their family members, and that's how they keep in contact with each other from far distances in the jungle. In the book, Fossey also discusses filming for National Geographic. The popular documentary made about her journey was edited footage from more than 2,000 hours of observations from 1967 to 1972. She meets her favorite gorilla, Digit, a young male who fear most gorillas show to humans. Digit is curious about Fossey and her employees, and he welcomes them all into his life. Fossey spends hundreds of hours with Digit. He is a very curious ape and likes playing with some of the other workers' cameras and journals. Compared to some of the political rebels and poachers Fossey encounters during life in Africa, the gorillas are much nicer than humans, Fossey writes. Poaching started to happen more and more on these gorillas and was a big reason the population of them was starting to drop so fast. They would be murdered for their skins, hands, heads, and would sell them for $20. Fossey was fed up with this, and her friend named Kelly Stewart was the first to see her emotions unfold. Stewart said that Fossey was in warrior mode and killing mode. Fossey's love for gorillas and her hatred for poachers really shaped her behavior. Her heart breaks when she finds a poacher has shot Brahms with an arrow. In 1977, poachers kill and sell body parts of Digit. The mother and uncle of baby gorilla named Quelly died trying to protect the baby from poachers. Quelly survived the attack. Sadly, a year later, poachers got to Quelly anyway and shot him in the head and killed him and sold his body parts as well. Fossey first went and complained to the Rwandan government about her gorillas being killed, which didn't help a thing. The government said poaching was the only way by which some of the Rwandan natives can help themselves survive. Fossey rejected what the government had to say, and from here on out, she was ready to dedicate herself and her life to saving the African American gorillas from illegal poaching and likely extinction. Fossey did whatever she had to do to protect her gorillas and try to stop the poaching. There are actual reports that she would capture and interrogate the poachers. Sometimes they would even be arranged to be tortured. Fossey also took a little different approach to stopping the harming of the gorillas. She would buy face masks and pretend to use black magic so locals and poachers would think she was a witch and would be scared off. Some locals referred to her as the Witch of Veringas. Fossey also ended up forming and leading many different anti-poaching patrols. She even burned down poachers' villages and staged a mock execution of one of the offenders. Diane ended up dying on December 26, 1985, asleep in her bed of her cabin, 2 years before this book was published. Her killers have not yet been found, but it is widely speculated that they were also poachers. She is now buried in Karasaki next to the graves of her other gorillas. A couple of my favorite parts from the book include reading about Fossey's ways on how she ended up becoming so close with the gorillas. How she was imitating their behavior, feeding, munching on celery stalks, scratching herself, banging on her chest. Another favorite part was when Fossey had to stay away from the gorillas even though she had such strong urges of wanting to go up to them and would break their trust with her. She had many of these altercations with Digit, which was also one of her favorites. In the book, she says, I resisted the urge to join Digit, who was huddled against the downpour and about 30 feet apart from the other animals. No matter how long she had keeping her distance and gaining trust with the gorillas, she would always hold back on her urges to wait for the gorillas to come to her. In the book, she said, it had been many months since he had shown any interest in observers, and I did not want to disrupt his growing independence. After a few minutes, I felt an arm around my shoulders. I looked up into Digit's warm, gentle brown eyes. This book also had lots of impacts on the world and myself personally. Personally, this book impacted me in an animal-loving way. It was a very emotional book with lots of up and downs. Without Diane Fossey risking her life, mountain gorillas would have gone extinct in the world. Mountain gorillas were once expected to be extinct in the millennium, but today the total number of the wild tops over 1,000. So without Diane Fossey, this beautiful creature would be extinct. Before Fossey's work, gorillas were also had an appealing reputation as violent brutes that would kill a human on sight. Fossey demolished this myth, living alongside a group of mountain gorillas in the forests of Rwanda. She showed these huge apes are actually gentle giants, with individual personalities in rich soil lives, and in many ways they are just like us. This book helped change the world to have different opinions and less fears against gorillas. In the book, Fossey mentions that after more than 2,000 hours of direct observation, she can account for more than less than 5 minutes of what she would call aggressive behavior. Through TV and her books, Fossey brought attention to the destruction of the rainforest and the cruel murder of apes. There are now tours available to go out and actually see the gorillas in their natural habitat in person at Bwindi Impenetrable National Park. A couple of things I learned about this book was that I learned about more about gorillas than I ever will in my life, and it was amazing. The ways they communicate, and they're so close to us. I also learned how comparable we are to gorillas. In the book, Ian Redmond, who worked with Fossey, said, gorillas are so like us, and they can see they're like us. They are as fascinated by us as we are with them. I also learned that only the bravest people in the world would ever do this type of work. Fossey, I don't know how you did it, but you're a brave person and you changed how we look at gorillas. I also learned about the habituation method and how to gain animal trust and loyalty. As I explained earlier in my speech, this is when Fossey was imitating all of the animals, and this is how she gained her trust with them. In conclusion, I'm glad I chose this book and was really lucky no one else in the class was able to choose it before me. It was one of the most amazing life stories I've ever read about, and it's going to be really hard to top. I'd really recommend this to any animal lovers and anybody who would love an amazing read. Thank you for listening.